Hi, good morning, New Life. My name's Lance Yarborough, and I have the privilege this morning of bringing you our daily devotional for our Advent season. This one is actually pretty ironic, and I'm convinced that God has just an amazing sense of humor. You see, this morning I'm going to be talking about enemies, which at first might seem like an odd topic for Advent, but hopefully here in just a few minutes you'll see that it's actually incredibly appropriate. The ironic part in all this is that just over a month ago, this is actually something that I was struggling with. It was a situation in our lives that I'll talk briefly about, and it was a real problem for me. And now I get to discuss that as our Advent topic for the devotional. So, without going into too many details, I had a family member. They were cheated out of a significant chunk of money, and I got really, really angry. See, we were 100% in the right, and the other party was completely in the wrong. I wanted to make sure that justice was served and this money was returned. When it started to look like that might not work out, I became very defiant. I started researching what our legal options were, and it just got kind of ugly. It was keeping me up at night. I had no peace in my life. I was angry and frustrated, and I was not going to let this guilty party get away with this. Now, to keep the story short, a good friend of mine gave me some sage advice, and that was to simply walk away, uh, to pray for the wrongdoers. This was only money, and it wasn't worth the damage that continuing to pursue it was going to ultimately cause. And he pointed out, what kind of testimony was I displaying? How was my faith being lived out in this circumstance? Now, this was exactly the opposite of what I wanted to hear, but there's no question it was exactly what I needed to hear. So, as I was considering this topic for the Advent devotional, God really helped me see a lot more clearly, based on what I'd gone through, what His desire is when we're in a circumstance like this. See, the passage that we're going to look at this morning comes from Matthew chapter 5. Jesus is teaching the famous Sermon on the Mount. He just finishes the Beatitudes, and now he's going to talk about some very light and fluffy and warm topics. He talks about anger and lust, divorce, oaths, and retaliation. And after all of those fun things, he gets to our passage. So I'm going to read Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 45. This is Jesus speaking, and he says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." Well, that's a really easy passage to just internalize and go live out, right? One thing that helps me in this situation is to remember that I was once an enemy of God. I was the wrongdoer who deserved the justice, who had done terrible things. I was 100% legally in the wrong and completely guilty. I had earned the wrath of God, just like that person that I was talking about had earned my wrath, but this is way worse. Um, but what did God offer instead of his justice? What I deserved. He offered me grace and mercy and love and ultimately hope. He offered me Jesus Christ, his son, who we would see very shortly after this was put to death by his enemies. You see, our default response to those that we see as our enemies, it seems totally natural. I mean, we don't like them. We don't want to be around them. We don't respect them. We wish they'd move, that they'd get fired, they'd disappear, or maybe worse. When we think about them, our thoughts can be pretty terrible. I know that in that situation, mine were. But Jesus is going to offer a different viewpoint here. This is a man who was crucified by his enemies, and he's encouraging us to love those who hate us. He commanded us to pray for them in good prayers for them. Why? He says, because we're the children of God. Now, in this Advent experience that New Life is inviting us all into, um, it's not just about seeing Jesus show up at Christmas time. Really, it's about seeing Jesus arrive or Jesus show up in everyday experiences. And if we're willing to look for him, that we're going to find him, frequently in unexpected ways. So seeing our enemy through the lens of love, yeah, that brings honor and respect for our Father in heaven. Praying for those who make our lives difficult, that's obedience to Jesus. Loving those who are difficult, that's the path that Jesus took. It's an act of love that he desires us to experience. And when we do these things, we're going to see Jesus show up in an incredible way. Trust me, I have been down that road very recently, and I promise you, you can bank on this, that if you follow through with this, that God shows up in amazing and wonderful ways. And that's my hope and my prayer for you, New Life, that as we soak on this passage, that we let Jesus work on our, at times, angry and hard hearts, that if we do that and we're obedient to this passage, that we love those who hate us and that we pray for those who are against us. If you can do those things, you're going to see Jesus in a powerful way. And that's my hope for you. God bless.